what does the heart of a godly leader look like? Too often we think of leadership as power and privilege and status. And then in the church, quite often, when leaders get a taste of this power and privilege, it consumes them. And they begin to become proud and to glory in their position as if they did something special to get it. But what really happens in the heart of a leader who loves God with everything that he is, who lives out of the overflow of his relationship with God? Well, today in our reading from 2 Samuel 5-9, we see David finally taking his place on the throne as the king of Israel, which God had promised him years ago that he would. And remember that God didn't choose David because he was the biggest, or the strongest, or the wisest, or the most skilled man in Israel. Twice it's recorded that God said he chose David simply because he's a man after God's own heart. David wasn't a great man. He was a normal man who loved a great God. And we're told even before David became king that every bit of his greatness and leadership came because the Lord was with him. So how does a man after God's own heart respond to the presence of God? Number one, he recognizes the greatness of God. In chapter 5, it says that David became greater and greater because the Lord was with him. And David knew that. In verse 12, he recognized that it was the Lord who established him as king, that it was the Lord who had made his kingdom great, and that it wasn't for David's sake, but it was for God's sake and for the sake of God's people. Second, a godly leader has a healthy fear and awe in God's presence. When they were bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, a man named Uzzah was struck dead by God because he reaches out and touches the Ark. And David was afraid because of that. He was in awe, even though he was chosen to be king by God himself. When he recognized the presence of a holy God, he said, "How can I be in the presence of such a God?" A godly leader has a deep reverence for God's presence. Number 3, David shows us that a godly leader is filled with joy when he's in the presence of God. When they brought the ark into Jerusalem finally, David was overcome with joy and he celebrated and he danced with all of his strength. He did it so much that his wife said it was embarrassing to watch him because she thought that the king should behave with much more dignity than that. But David recognized that he was in the presence of the true king, and so he was simply overcome with joy. Response number 4 to God's presence that we see in David is humility. Chapter 7, when he thought about everything that God had done for him in his life and through his life, he was overwhelmed by the grace of God. He says in verse 18, "Lord, who am I that you've brought me this far? And who is Israel that you, the God and the King above everything, would redeem them and bring them to himself as his very own people? Yes, I'm the king of Israel, but you are the God of Israel, and I'm just your servant. All of this is by your grace." And finally, we see in David that a godly leader freely shares with others the grace that he knows he has received from God. In chapter 9, David thinks of his friend Jonathan, and he asks if there's anybody left in his family that he can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake. And the only one remaining was Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet. Now the rest of society would have just thrown him away as useless, but David knew the grace of God, and he did for Mephibosheth what God had done for David. He called him, he loved him, he gave him an inheritance, and he invited him to eat with him daily as a son at his table. We learned from David that a true godly leader doesn't put himself on the billboard. He points everybody to God, because a true godly leader is amazed at God's greatness. He's in awe of God's holiness. He's delighted in God's presence. He's humbled by God's grace, and he's eager to share the grace that he's received with others.